All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Hillary Pennington, and I oversee the webinar programming here at DDX for Sketchy. Today's session, we will be focusing on what it actually looks like to implement clinical reasoning simulation within the medical curriculum. As programs continue to explore new approaches to developing and assessing clinical reasoning, many educators are asking practical questions about implementation, learner engagement, assessment, and educational impact. We'll hear from two medical schools participating in the Clinical Reasoning Catalyst program as they share their implementation approaches, observations, and lessons learned. Our goal is to provide a candid look at what has worked and what they've learned along the way and what they are continuing to evaluate. To help guide that conversation, I am excited to introduce our speakers. First, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Alan Sazama, inaugural chair of the Department of Emergency Medicine at the University of South Dakota, Sanford School of Medicine. Dr. Sazama has been leading efforts to integrate DDX into clerkship curriculum at USD and is particularly interested in how clinical reasoning simulation can support learner development and assessment in authentic clinical training environments. Today, he'll share the university's implementation approach, early observations, and future plans for the program. Next, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Colleen Hayden, Associate Dean for Program Evaluation and Assessment at the University of Missouri School of Medicine. In her role, Dr. Hayden oversees program evaluation and assessment initiatives across the medical school and has been leading Missouri's efforts to explore DDX as a formative assessment tool for clinical reasoning. She'll share how her team has implemented DDX across the curriculum and what they've learned so far, and how they're thinking about measuring educational impact moving forward. Finally, joining us as moderator is Dr. Ben Mueller, Chief Content Officer here at Sketchy. Ben oversees content across both Sketchy's core learning platform and DDX by Sketchy, and has spent several years working at the intersection of clinical education and instructional design. So his work focuses on translating complex medical concepts into practical, engaging learning experiences that reflect how clinicians actually think and make decisions in practice. Just before we get started, a few quick session details. The session is being recorded, so we'll share the recording afterward. And just to set expectations and timing, we'll begin with a brief overview of DDX and the Clinical Reasoning Catalyst program, followed by implementation presentations from the University of South Dakota and University of Missouri. We'll then move to a moderated discussion with our panelists and audience Q&A. We'll be keeping an eye on audience questions as we go, so please feel free to submit yours anytime using the Q&A feature. And with that, I will turn it over to Ben.
Awesome. Thanks, Hillary. And I'll add my own thanks to Alan and Colleen for being here this morning or afternoon, depending on where you are, and for participating in the Catalyst Grant, along with all of our participating schools and faculty. The Catalyst Grant has been an incredible experience for us, particularly on my team, getting to work with faculty like Alan and Colleen. I think part of the appeal and sort of joy of medical education is getting to teach the hardest things to the smartest students, and getting to experience that via Alan and Colleen it's just been fun. So with that said, before I let them talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about DDX and give you all some context for what it is for those who haven't heard of it before. DDX is our clinical reasoning platform. So we use AI tools to help students practice patient cases and clinical reasoning processes. We think the best way to do this is to sit with a patient in a room and talk to them. But that's a hard experience to have, especially on a regular or sort of repeatable basis. And so DDX gives us a way to mimic that experience very realistically and in a way that students can do over and over again and sort of get their reps and practice in a way that's just not really feasible in sort of traditional clinical settings. We have a very large library of cases. We have the opportunity for faculty to build their own cases, and we've been working with our Catalyst partners to do that as well. And we think of this really as a longitudinal learning experience. Students get to work through all kinds of patient cases, all kinds of different scenarios, from early to late in sort of their training pathways. And then we help faculty identify and understand who needs more help by using those cases to really see inside the students' thought processes. So we think it's a really powerful and cool platform. I'm like, sort of trying to blow it up too much. I'll let Alan and Colleen do that for us. But Hillary, you can move on. So, sort of the four core experiences in DDX right now, primarily a clinical reasoning platform, as I've alluded to already. And in fact, we sat down last summer with a group of faculty from across the country, including Alice Tang and Todd Cassis, who have been helping shepherd the Catalyst program as well, to build out our sort of own clinical reasoning assessment rubric. And so we did that based on some published literature, the ART and IDEA scales that already exist, but modified that for use in this virtual setting and to take advantage again of some of the ways that we can see what students are thinking in a way that's not really practicable in real life. And so we use these tools to both teach students how to learn and do this decision-making process that folks like Alan do kind of implicitly. And we build these habits of mind in students and then allow educators to evaluate and understand how their learners are doing. And again, all of that can be done at a scale that's just not sort of feasible in a real clinical setting. We also have communications cases. And in particular, we've just recently introduced a cool new avatar feature where you can talk face to face with a very realistic patient. I'll put in a plug right now. If you haven't done it already, go set up a free trial account and you can try that avatar out today. These are cases where you communicate with patients to have difficult conversations, as well as with other colleagues and other professionals in consults or handoff settings that they'll have to do when they're real clinicians. We then also have routine care cases, so more outpatient medicine where a patient doesn't come in with a chief complaint. There's not necessarily a diagnostic mystery here. You just have to walk them through this sort of standard but extremely important interaction and make sure you're keeping them up to date on their screening and sort of all the stuff that you would do in that setting as well. And then finally, we have a set of clinical skills cases that give students the opportunity to practice the more technical skills that they'll need on rotations in residency and in practice, like interpreting EKGs or chest x-rays, looking at lab values and understanding what they mean. We have some POCUS cases. It's actually a pretty cool component of the product. And so finally, before we turn it over to our stars here, just a word about the Catalyst Grant Program. So last year, we awarded this grant to 12 different schools with the goal of really sort of taking a step forward in medical education and adding this powerful new technology. We want to think about how we can scale this, as I've said a number of times now. How can we build that scale in settings where it's hard to do that right now? And then in collaboration with our partners, how can we study both the implementation of those tools? These are hard things to put into practice, as Colleen and Alan can probably attest to. What are good ways to do that, and how can we look at that, as well as what are outcomes? How does this actually impact students' clinical reasoning abilities and their performance as clinicians? We have all different sizes and types of schools in the program, as you can see there on the right, and so we get to look at this across a variety of different settings. And then we want to share that back and publish this as scholarly research, and I know that that is underway in various stages across the program. So with that, I think we can turn it over to Alan to talk a little bit more about his experience at USD.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. So as mentioned, Alan Sazama, my new title as of a month ago is I'm the inaugural chair for our Department of Emergency Medicine here at University of South Dakota. My prior role, I was the assistant dean of medical education and oversaw our Pillar 2, which is our core clerkship year. You may have different thoughts about AI as you signed up for this. One thing that I had a lot of passion for, which led us to apply for the Catalyst grant in the first place, was seeing a lot of our students utilizing AI instead of their own clinical reasoning. Seeing a patient, typing in an open evidence and, getting a sprint out of what they should do. what I like about Sketchy, and as we'll kind of talk here how we've implemented it, is that it's using AI to help teach a really human skill, which is clinical reasoning. So really enjoyed being part of the Catalyst grant, really enjoyed seeing how our students are interacting with it. So next slide, please. Just wanted to give a really high level overview of what our curriculum looks like at University of South Dakota. I'll probably reference a couple of these things. So before we signed up for the Catalyst grant, we actually utilized it a little bit in our pre-clinical year, our Pillar 1, which is a 18-month experience. We specifically utilized it in a cardiovascular physical diagnosis course where the students would complete some cases with a cardiovascular focus. But we thought, what can we do to expand our usage? So when we were awarded the grant, I specifically was working with Pillar 2, which is a longitudinal integrated clerkship for 12 months, where we do all 7 core disciplines over a 12-month period. So we wanted to figure out how we could implement that into that part of the curriculum and see if there were some pros and cons as we went along. And then finally, we have Pillar 3, which is our fourth year of med school, essentially, is a way to describe it, but the time for the students to incorporate electives and away rotation, sub-Is, et cetera. So next slide. So before we got the grant, we and are still utilizing a different company's software as well to aid in our kind of asynchronous instruction of the clerkships. We have a partnership at our school with Online MedEd, which, if you're familiar with that or not, they have a platform known as CaseX, which also takes students through different medical cases. It's largely a click-through type experience, meaning the students, rhetorically ask the questions internally and then just click forward on the case as opposed to an interactive experience. Very poorly reviewed by our students over the last several years. So we're looking for a different way to kind of expose them to some important cases in the core disciplines. So as part of our Catalyst grant team, we had 2 of our clerkship directors, family medicine and internal medicine. So for our pilot this year, we basically rolled it out in 2 of our clerkships. Our major goal with the Catalyst 2 was to participate more in the scholarship piece. So we're incorporating this alongside our CaseX. So instead of requiring 14, we're doing 14 CaseX. We're doing 7 Sketchy cases and 7 CaseX. And then we have a group of students that are on the Catalyst team as well that are working to develop a survey that we're going to roll out to our students actually here fairly soon to see their thoughts on clinical reasoning and how this impacted clinical reasoning, and then their satisfaction comparing the 2 different ways of doing things. Next slide. So we rolled it out to all 70 of our Pillar 2 students. Sketchy has been fantastic to work with as far as getting accounts set up. We've been able to get our campus coordinators who help kind of monitor student completion. They've had the opportunity to get access as well, so can monitor if students have completed these. Right now in our curriculum, they are just completion points, as had been the CaseX prior. So they have to complete 7 cases basically in their first semester of both of these particular disciplines. We kept the other specialties, their requirements the same. So they're doing CaseX for like surgery as an example. I put now that right as we stand right now, we have a 94% completion rate, which actually for this point of the year is actually very good for us. This will get to 100% because it is a requirement for them to pass the clerkship. So next slide. So as mentioned, the students are rolling out a survey here. I anticipate in the next month, we're just working with the USD IRB and then getting the student survey out to the students. Several questions asking about their satisfaction, how they think it's relevant to their clinical rotations, and then their perceived improvement in clinical reasoning skills. Future directions, we want to start to think if this could be a part of our summative assessments. We want to look and see if this can augment our OSCE experience. Here, and I'm sure at other institutions as well, we struggle with faculty sufficiency. We struggle with the ability to recruit faculty to teach things such as the OSCE. So what can we do to utilize AI to augment kind of what we're doing currently is a big future interest of ours. And then finally, can we use an assessment such as this, which spits out different metrics with regards to clinical reasoning, to guide the preceptors when they're teaching our students in the clinics, hospitals, and ORs? Can that give them areas of focus to teach and to augment their experience between preceptors and the students? So next slide. And finally, I mean, we don't have the data yet to present to you because, like I say, we haven't rolled out the survey as of yet. But our students are pleased. We're hearing really good things from the students anecdotally, and I think will be shown throughout the survey when those results do come back. Students enjoy the interactive nature of this. It's almost like a gamification of clinical material, which they've reported enjoying quite a bit. And we're seeing a lot more utilization above the requirements as well, which I think speaks to how they're enjoying how this can provide some additional instruction during the clerkship year. Next slide. I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Hayden to explain how things are going over at the University of Missouri Columbia.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alan. So very much like you, I loved what you said. It's trying to figure out how to best utilize AI to teach that human skill. And for us, not just teaching it, but really assessing it in a comparable, consistent way. I would be, people would probably be really bummed out if they didn't hear the letters LCME come out of my mouth, since I do quite a bit on the accreditation side of things. So whether at the University of Missouri or other schools I worked with or other colleagues that I talk with, comparability across our various sites and across our regional campuses, for those of us who have regional campuses, is really necessary and required by the accreditors. And this is such a critical piece of education and assessment, and getting it right and doing it consistently is very difficult, I think, to some of what Alan pointed out. So in my role as the Associate Dean for Program Evaluation and Assessment, I was very lucky to be able to partner with our Associate Dean for Curriculum, Joel Schenker, and we decided to go ahead and apply for this grant because we have been doing clinical reasoning exams either written or typed, we'll say typed now. We've been doing written clinical reasoning exams or CREs for the last 20 years at Mizzou Med. It requires individual faculty to actually read up to 128 students' clinical reasoning exam, let's say essays. That is a significant amount of effort and work. And not that it can't be consistently done, but from year to year, from block to block or course to course, how are we really ensuring that they are being objectively measured and assessed versus subjectivity? So we were really interested in the grant to help us address our needs again at Mizzou, and then how we could better inform other schools who are interested in this same area and be able to work with our colleagues, this community of practice that has been built through the Catalyst grant. All right, next slide. So as I kind of said, we have been doing CRE exams, and they are actually summatively graded. So they are part of the requirement to pass one of our 8 blocks in the first 2 years. So we are in the process right now of going through major curriculum overhaul. So we'll be moving from a 2x2 model to very similar to what Alan showed at University of South Dakota, something with an 18-month pre-clerkship phase, a earlier start to the clerkship years, and then a little bit longer of an advanced medicine phase to give them more exposure to their clinical interests and such. So right now what we are doing is we are implementing up to 4 cases in each of these 8 blocks. So, if I can do my math, we're anywhere from 24 to 32 cases we are utilizing right now in our first 2 years of the curriculum. And in our third year, we have chosen to do 5 cases in our internal medicine clerkship. So students who are in internal medicine are receiving the cases while they're on that 7-week block clerkship. So we've identified very specific cases that fit obviously the content. That's been the beauty of having access to the database of the cases to select from. You can sort by pre-clerkship or clinical clerkship. It really helps a bit of differentiating what the level of your learner is. So that's been extremely helpful. We are really interested and excited to already see these early outputs that we're getting from the data. And it's showing us where individual students are struggling all the way to where the cohort of students are doing really, really well or where they're struggling. So we can identify how to remediate and help those individual students who need some more focused attention and skill building to where are we struggling maybe on the curricular level? Like where could we be doing better within our introductory to patient care coursework? Where can our patient-based learning curriculum be enhanced and improved? And as we're going through major curriculum reform, this is the perfect time for us to be collecting such really robust data to be able to identify how we do better to teach the skills and then again assess the skills on a continual basis. Next slide. So again, we're covering it across 3 years. I think the piece that speaks for itself is when the 4th-year students who just graduated earlier in the spring when we implemented it, when the 4th-year students found out that we had this grant and they could have access to, again, the kind of gamification of testing their skills. I had so many 4th-year students reach out to me to say, hey, could you just assign us some cases? And again, since you're able to find them kind of at the clinical level or that residency level, you can select from them in the database. I was able to select for them a variety of different cases that we wouldn't have been assigning to our earlier learners. And they were able to utilize them over the last, probably not anymore, but over the last couple of months post-match, they were able to interact with it just to keep up with their skills. And again, we get to offer them something that we've not been able to offer them. Sketchy has a name brand and it's name recognition. So it was really wonderful to be able to offer this product in this really neat new take on assessing this skill to all of our learners. So right now we've reached about 400 of our learners across the board. I wish that our completion rate was as high as Alan's is, but unfortunately, when you don't have a carrot or a stick and all we say is it's required, but there's really no way to require it at the moment in the way we have our curriculum structured. 60% completion rate, I'm going to take it. The feedback has been very positive. Some of the students have given some really specific feedback that I'll feed to the DDX team at Sketchy that may help just in improvements with the interface and some specific feedback about cases. But overall, they really enjoy the utility of this. The other benefit is at the end of the case, they actually get MCQ, MBME style questions that are related to that specific case. So it gives them the opportunity to do some practice questions as well, because I'm sure it's not just our students who are always eager for ways in which they can practice Q banks and such. All right, next slide. And again, student feedback has been very positive. Our faculty are also very impressed, again, with that class level and the individual level reports. The other piece of it you get to see in that data is how many of your students are asking for hints. So once you're in the system, you can actually see how many times certain students are asking for hints along the way. And that I'm very interested to see over time if that has any correlation with other assessment types we have, whether it's OSCEs or our written CRE exams, to see if there's any way to indicate any correlation again with what we're grading on the summative side versus how the students are participating with these DDX cases on the formative side. Ben has been outstanding to work with. He is so quick to respond. And yes, you're very welcome. Thank you so much. If I have issues with our learners not being able to access it, sometimes it's because they're using the wrong email or something didn't get set up. But we have a very quick turnaround, very easy implementation. I couldn't ask for a better partner in this. Thank you so much. And then being part of just the grant process has been wonderful because we get to interact with people like Alan and others at many different schools across the country. So MD schools, GME programs, and DO schools. And we get to talk about how we can do better for our learners at any point in the continuum. And it's been really validating and helpful as we think about doing better for our learners across the country. All right, next slide. One thing we're definitely I'd say like our biggest lesson learned is thinking about how we're going to follow up with the students after they complete the DDX cases. So that is on my list of things for the summer, is to really think about how are we going to kind of pre-brief them on what to expect, what to do with it, what to do with it individually, and then how we're going to debrief them as a class on what we're learning about them, again, as a cohort. And let them know how we're going to utilize that information for curricular improvement. So as many of us know, a lot of that, you said it, we did it, really does go a long way for students to understand and appreciate why we are asking them to do different things, and that it's not just busy work. It's not something that's just the flavor of the month. It is something that's actually really important and valuable in what we do for them, and how that helps us for future students as well. So we're going to be more intentional about how we talk about it ahead of time. And then again, what we're going to do with the data on the back end to follow up with them as they move through our curriculum. All right, next slide.
All right.
I think that was it for me.
Yeah, thank you so much. And with that, we are going to be moving on to the moderated portion. And we want this to be as engaging as possible. So please feel free to enter any of your questions into the Q&A feature of Zoom, and we will be sure to include that in the discussion. But to kick things off, I'll hand it over to Ben.
Awesome. So I have a bunch of questions for the both of you, but actually we've already gotten a couple questions in. So I want to address at least one of those first. Mark asked us, is this a custom GPT or is this generative AI with defined guardrails and a defined case so it can't hallucinate? And the short answer is the latter half of that description is pretty accurate. So all of our cases rely on an AI large language model sort of behind the scenes, acting effectively as a standardized patient or standardized attending, which isn't really a concept that we have in the real world, but the AI has been given its character, given its background, its history, sort of the scope of knowledge that it needs. So the patient knows all about itself, but it doesn't know anything about the diagnosis or sort of medical terminology that a real patient wouldn't. And so we use that faculty underpinning to ground the model and prevent those kinds of hallucinations and keep the scope sort of appropriate for the case. I hope that answers your question, Mark. And then Nikisha asked in the Q&A, and so by the way, feel free to put questions in the Q&A or in the chat. We'll find them in either place. Is this similar to the human DX cases, and can you tailor it to address in training exam objectives? It's similar in the sense that these are sort of patient cases that unfold in front of the learner and provide some feedback along the way. I have a slight amount of bias here, but we think our cases are a lot more robust and have a lot more actionable and useful feedback for both learners and educators. In terms of the in-training exam question, absolutely, we actually have a whole separate residency program library. All of the schools, almost all the schools in the Catalyst program are focused on UME, but we do have one that's focused on GME, and so they have a different case library essentially. Okay, so back to the stars of our show. So you both alluded to this a little bit, but what do you feel like you've learned about your students or about your program since you've started DDX? And I think both sides of that can be interesting here, right? Obviously, the ultimate goal of DDX is to learn something about your students and help guide their training. But I think, especially for this audience, how you implemented it and sort of what you learned about that process can also be pretty interesting. So yeah, maybe Alan, we'll start with you.
I think a couple big things that I would point out that we've kind of learned, the implementation, I echo what Colleen was saying. Sketchy and Ben, everyone has been fantastic to work with, and we're not having a lot of issues from that regard. And if there are issues, they're resolved quickly. So the implementation, I think, has actually been pretty easy. One thing we're learning about our students is not only do they enjoy this sort of thing, but the feedback that the clinical reasoning assessment is spitting out is a lot more valuable and specific to where students are excelling and struggling than our standard faculty preceptor assessments. We struggle mightily, as I'm sure a lot of schools do, with grade inflation with our assessments. And it's hard to distinguish, from student to student who's excelling and who's struggling, first of all, but then also what are the areas where they can really focus in on. So I think that's one thing that it's been surprising, maybe of sorts, that we get such detailed feedback on each student. There has been the other cool thing, I think, is not only the cohort you can see as well, but you can also see each individual student, how long they spent on the case, how many hints they had to use, what score they got on the question part of it. And then it breaks it apart into like history taking, initial differential management, et cetera, which I have found to be a really valuable tool as we kind of work to instruct our students.
So I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, Colleen, I don't know anything else that you'd add to sort of what you've learned about your students here program.
Yeah, I think that's been very helpful. The other piece is seeing how long they actually take working in the case. So you get that data point as well. And looking at how much they complete. And then for us, I utilize some of that to look at, again, since we didn't have it as a requirement, being able to see how many of our students actually participated doing it, completed the whole case, or took very little time kind of get from start to finish, and then looking at their summative assessment grades for their clinical reasoning exams that we just had a few weeks ago. I would say early, there's probably a little bit of correlation there with those who didn't do it, and then they didn't score as high as I would have hoped on their end of course CREs. But again, it's early data, but it also is interesting again to look at kind of again student behavior and performance. Not so much just performance, but again, we get to see a little bit on that side of that behavior right now for us because it's not required, and we get to see who is choosing to do it, and again, how much time they're actually spending with it. That's been very insightful.
Amazing. I think I saw you starting to type the answer to this question, but I'll read it aloud so you can answer for everyone. You mentioned some feedback that for improvements that you've heard from students, and why don't you tell us a little bit about what those things are and what we've done so far, if anything, to sort of make those adjustments.
I think one is an easy one to state, but maybe not an easy one to fix because it may go against the entire intention of the DDX system. But I had one student who was just very frustrated that they had to have the exact 3 diagnoses to get credit for it in the system. So it may have been their misunderstanding of the process, or just, again, a little bit feeling boxed in on the process. But again, to build something that can be utilized across, tens of thousands of users, there has to be some constraints on it. So I'll share some more of that feedback, but nothing earth-shattering, nothing that can't be overcome. Again, some of it related to what I said, which is really being more intentional, but with a pre-brief with the students, so they know exactly what they're getting into, what is expected of them, how the system's working, and what the system's not doing. And that's not a fault of the DDX. It's just, I think, level setting the expectations.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned some of that, and I think Mark asked us a question as well about what the size of the content is, and is it plausible to have, could you have 50 cases for infectious diseases or something like that? And I think one of the really powerful things about the platform, again, that distinguishes it from doing standardized patient cases or patient cases in the sim lab or something like that is it's quite easy for us to make those enhancements. And so adding a pre-brief is pretty straightforward. Increasing the scope of cases for infectious diseases is pretty straightforward. And so we have that flexibility, and we've worked with Catalyst partners and our other partners as well to kind of make some of those changes. Um, Question for Alan in the Q&A. What types of cases have been the most challenging for learners, and what does that tell you about the curriculum or patient types that students maybe not aren't seeing as typically?
So that's a great question. There are different difficulties of cases that you can select. Um, I some of the more kind of bread and butter cases. For example, there's a pneumonia case. Students are all scoring very well on that. We look at our clerkship directors as they chose the 7 cases. I think part of our curriculum design is largely outpatient with the longitudinally integrated clerkship. We do integrate some inpatient time, but some of the diagnoses that are either rarer or more on the inpatient side, I think students have struggled a little bit more with those. There's an example. I think there's this easy bruising case that I think it ends up being like Cushing's disease. I took that case, and that's hard. That was hard for me, let alone our students. I mean, I think the benefit, however, I think you can really, the library is huge. I don't know exactly the number of cases, but it is very large. And there are there's pre-clerkship level cases, clerkship, all the way up to, attending level. So there are a robust amount of cases to choose from that I think as you went through and if you saw gaps in your curriculum of, man, we don't have a lot of endocrine exposure. Our students are struggling on, step 2 in that area. I mean, you could definitely find some of those, I think, pretty easily through the platform.
Awesome. Yeah, I actually just dropped this in the chat because this was sort of the other part of Mark's question, but we have about 300 cases in the library right now. And like I said, we have ways for not just through the Catalyst grant, but just in the product, we have ways for faculty to request new case topics that we aim to turn around in about 2 days. Um, awesome. Jennifer asked, and I think this is for both of you, although I certainly have an opinion on this as well, but do the AI cases replace or augment in-person content?
Augment here. I'm a big, like, I don't ever see complete replacement of in-person. Like, to me, that loses a lot what a medicine is about, of, the human connection of taking care of another person. So I see this as an augmentation tool, at least for us here at USD, to help again strengthen skills with some of the limitations that we have of faculty. I mean, I would love here to do OSCEs in every clerkship after every, quarter. The finances aren't there. We have logistical challenges of our students being across the state of South Dakota. So it's a travel piece. So what can we do with using something like this to augment the in-person content they're experiencing in their clerkships? That's what we're all about here at USD.
Yeah, I would echo essentially everything you said. And for us, it's less about them building their skills. It's more about, again, the assessment of those skills, and then for us to utilize that to help enhance the curriculum and help enhance them. What I would want is to see these utilized again in a formative way in which before they get to an OSCE, since they essentially replaced, CS. For us, we only do OSCEs right at the start of the 4th year. And we just had students complete those. And we had several for probably no real reason that just didn't pass them on first attempt. I know they did fine in the clerkship, so I'm not sure what it was that they were missing. But how can we use this over time to say, don't forget to do these things? These are important. This is the stuff you have to do. It's giving them that immediate feedback. And again, then we see it and we know that they're keeping up with those skills in a way in which we're not worried about grade inflation and bias on the preceptor evaluations that we see. We just don't get necessarily the level of detailed feedback we all need. And I'm sure that's a universal problem. But how can we just keep up with it with the learners and make sure they recognize what the important skill sets are that they need to be doing and get some, again, feedback that again, yes, it's AI based, but it's physicians who built this. This is not what is being built into this. How the rubric was built by doctors. This isn't a tool that was just created by IT folks with no medical training.
Hopefully this isn't a surprising or controversial opinion, but I completely agree. This should augment real patient or even standardized patient interactions. There's nothing like being in the room with the patient and, especially when it's early on in your training, getting a little diaphoretic and a little tachycardic and feeling that moment and feeling how important it is to be there. Um, so, you know, the point of medicine is to take care of human beings, and there's no substitute for that. We do think this gives a lot of other opportunities, as we've all talked about, to practice and to practice safely. The amount of oversight. I mean, I'm sure, Alan, you work with the students where you're like, I don't know if I'm ready for you to go into a patient room and talk to them by yourself. And so the amount of oversight that's required to make sure that interaction is appropriate is a lot. And being able to do this in a way that doesn't need that level of kind of monitoring is really valuable, giving students the opportunity to practice many different types of presentations, many different types of disease processes, just do the same case over and over, which again, you can't really do in real life. We think there are a lot of benefits that help them perform when they're then in that moment where they're, a little tachycardic. Um, Question about the educator side. And so have you heard any feedback from preceptors or supervisors about how DDX is impacting readiness or performance on rotations? And I don't know if you have or not, but curious what you think there.
I think, and I saw an earlier question too, like resistance.
Yep.
We experience much resistance. My answer to that is largely no. Yeah, I think the resistance that we see is just trying something new, which I think is I've learned working in education as opposed to just medicine, like things just move a little slower sometimes, and that I think is probably the most resistance we're experiencing. I think how we're going to address that is just by one, showing some data that students are enjoying it. And then I think just familiarizing some of our other clerkship directors what this can do and what it can offer them. And I think that we'll win them over of sorts without much difficulty. Um, and then the other question was, remind me, Ben. Oh, feedback from the preceptors.
Yep. About readiness or performance. Yeah.
Um, you know, I think probably my answer would be too early on to have significant feedback. The preceptors are commenting that students are talking about these cases, which to me I think is a big win because that tells me that there's some dialogue happening about challenging medical problems with an expert, with a physician. So indirectly, I think we're seeing some positive impacts. I mean, this cohort happens to be doing fairly well for us thus far. I don't know if I can attribute that to them completing the DDX cases this early on, but I think we're starting to see some positive momentum that it indeed is at least leading to some fruitful dialogue about clinical cases.
Colleen, anything to add on that one?
Nothing else to add again, too early on. And we've not really asked the question of, do you think you could correlate these two in any way? We are a heavily problem-based learning curriculum. So PBL is the bread and butter of our pre-clerkship curriculum. So they are practicing that skill all the time. So it's hard to attribute it to DDX necessarily, but we have always heard that the students are better able to navigate and communicate because they've been practicing the skill in that way. And again, for me, this is so much more on the trying to get really comparable, consistent assessment of that skill and that data so we can use it for quality improvement.
Awesome. We have a question here that I can answer for you. So in your programs, do students subscribe and assume the cost? So Colleen and Alan, because they are grantees, get to use DDX for free. So nobody's paying. For our typical partners, we have a variety of ways whether the institution pays or that cost is passed on to students. We can do that through the product, or we have all kinds of ways to handle that question. Have you been planning? I can answer at least the first part of this, but I'm curious for your take on the second. Have you been planning to integrate the tool since the beginning of the program for the introductory concepts. I thought that meant since the beginning of your program, but I'm realizing now, I think that means have you been starting with DDX sort of early on in education, sort of in the preclinical, pre-clerkship phase for basic science concepts, or sort of where do you think about integrating that?
We have a little bit of that in our pre-clerkship in that cardio diagnosis course. I think there's a lot of opportunities. We're undergoing, we just got through our LCME accreditation, are looking at curriculum reform here at USD. So I think that's going to be an opportunity to look at, can we integrate some of these cases through some of their organ systems blocks in the pre-clerkship years. Clinical exposure exists in the pre-clerkship years for us here, but it's somewhat limited. And again, has the same constraints of faculty availability. So if we could get some more early clinical exposure, knowing that step one is, having an increasing focus on clinical vignettes, I think there's a lot of interest and I think potential there to incorporate it earlier.
Yeah, and we obviously already implemented it with our earlier learners because it was January of the first year. So we got first year students halfway through the curriculum. What I'm excited about is the continuation of the grant since it's for the full 2026 calendar year. We'll be able to utilize it for our incoming first year students who will start at the end of July, early August. So we will be, picking cases that very likely relate to what the CRE topics are. They don't know that yet because it's a summative assessment, but what will be on their CRE cases, and also related to a lot of those are PBL cases that they would have learned about to really understand and apply these early clinical skills and basic science content in our kind of early introductory course for biochemistry, physiology, cell biology.
Awesome. And yeah, don't worry, we'll cut that out of the YouTube so none of your students get a leg up. Um, what initiatives are being implemented to ensure that students not only know how to answer questions in an academic setting, but also understand the need to acquire in-depth knowledge to work in the health field? And so maybe this is a little bit about that bridge from kind of the classroom phase to actually putting this into practice.
I feel like we're already doing that, and DDX is just continuing to augment that teaching, learning, and assessment piece of it. But again, like many curriculum that have a lot of case-based learning and conversations and small group discussions and introductions to patient care curriculum, all of that. I really don't see how we're not all doing this already, and DDX just becomes just a piece of that pie of how we're ensuring that they are ready for clinical care and they're practicing that again in a safe environment to get ready for their clinical years, all the while also giving them those opportunities to practice questions so they know how to answer questions, whether they are MCQ style or oral style questions.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, this is just a part of the curriculum. I don't think it would be wise to make it the only part of your curriculum because of that fact that you do need there's so many skills that are necessary for my work as a physician and then all our students' future work as physicians. So I think it's a part of it. I will say I've been very impressed when I go through cases that it's not just knowledge stuff that you have to know. Like you have to present to an attending, like, which is wild to me. You're presenting to this virtual attending and they'll give you feedback of like, ooh, that was a little sketch, or work on improving, how you explain this. It's um much more robust than I anticipated when I started to go through. I didn't know about the avatar, so I'm excited to check that out later and kind of see that as well. But I think it does dive more into some of the other skills required in the healthcare field than I anticipated when I first kind of signed on with this. So, in short, utilize your whole entire curriculum to get there. But I think I have been surprised at how robust the experience is for the students going through the cases.
I'm glad you mentioned the attending presentation because that was born out of much med student trauma for all of us here at Sketchy. Um, on the sort of scholarship side, what research or scholarship do you think are you hoping will come out of the work you're doing or that you know about from the Catalyst group as a whole? And I'm glad you mentioned the kind of community of practice here and that you get to interact with these other programs as well.
Yeah, we work, we get paired up with another school, and we're working with colleges, Georgia. You know, they have a similar kind of setup, a lot of rural areas that we do here in South Dakota. So, my hope is one goal is campus comparability is a big thing for us, but also, again, just the access, logistics that we run across that make it difficult to provide highly meaningful clinical educational opportunities. Not, we get put students in our rural clinics and hospitals, no problem. All of our campus sites do very well. But how can we prove, that this is providing a meaningful experience and assessment of skills so that we can, expand this out into our more rural areas? That's the global vision I would have for where the research is going. We're starting small with this student project with some survey questions and trying to get a little sense of, this is something they even like, that they're finding value from, but larger expanding out to, could this be a way to solve some of the faculty sufficiency problems that we have in all of our campuses, but specifically in our more rural areas?
Yeah, extremely similar. So we have been paired up with the University of Washington, and they're part of the WWAMI group. So they have even more of a spread in differences across their clinical training sites than even Alan and I are probably experiencing at our own schools. So it has been really, I think it's been really eye-opening to be able to have an opportunity to talk with them and then utilize this as the piece that we talk about, but then have more conversations. They're really interested in seeing how it's going to help again with that comparability and consistency of assessment across their training sites because they are using so much of a larger volunteer workforce even than many of us probably are. And as we're expanding our clinical site into Springfield, we're going from a 2-year to a 4-year curriculum. This again gives us an opportunity to have a product that we can use more for again comparability and consistency for all of our faculty. And I'm excited to see how we can use it for some faculty development as well. And we haven't really got to that yet, but that is going to be a next part of this for us is how do we really get the faculty more comfortable with it? The students are comfortable with it. It's gamifying education for them, and they're so much more used to that. But how do we get the faculty, not just the administrative leadership, really invested in using it and understanding how it can benefit our students?
Yeah, that's awesome. I think the sort of scholarship and these kinds of bigger questions that you've both alluded to are what we're also really excited about for the grant and just for our collaborations with you both and with all of our academic partners. So glad to hear about that. I'm glad you mentioned the kind of faculty education side, Colleen, because Alice in particular and Todd have been working on some coaching products as well and figuring out how we can teach faculty to be better teachers, to think about these new tools that students are using. We live in a world of AI. You can't sort of escape hearing about it anymore. And how do we level up trainees who need to use that technology responsibly and get faculty to a place where they can teach about it? So all super interesting questions. Sorry, I could go down a whole rabbit hole here. But I think we've answered all of the questions that we had in the QA and the chat. So unless any last minute things come in, I think we'll wrap up here. I don't know, Hillary, if you have any last minute stuff.
So before we wrap up, if you're interested in seeing firsthand how DDX can support your learners and test out the platform, we invite you to sign up for a free trial. You can follow the QR code. I'll also include it in the follow-up email that will include the recording to today's session. Yeah, and reach out if you would like to meet with a member of our team to learn more as well. And with that, I'd just like to thank Dr. Sazama and Dr. Hayden, and of course, Ben. Thank you for sharing your experiences and insights today. And thank you all for joining. Really great conversation and great questions that you asked. And as a reminder, we'll be sending the slides. And thank you again for spending part of your day with us. And best of luck as you continue to innovate and strengthen clinical reasoning education within your own programs. Thank you all. Take care.